So recently, some chunk of LA burned down. Really fancy houses, really rich people. These people had paid tons of money to live in that exact spot. They found a lot of value in being there. What happens when we see value independent of other variables, such as over time? Those people did not account for the possibility that their entire neighborhood could be burned down to ashes. If they had, they obviously wouldn't have paid the money they did to live there, or they would have built their houses out of concrete instead of wood. How does this relate to our lives? There are multiple scriptures that talk about how blessings we receive will be subjected to fire. And the fire of chaos, the fire of circumstances that we do not expect, can absolutely change the value that we see in things. One of the materials that's listed in these scriptures is straw. Now, straw is extremely flammable. It can be very useful. So right now, I have a big old pile of straw out on my farm, and the animals use it for insulation. It's great to soak up liquid in their pens, and it breaks down into really nice compost. But it's not fireproof. And so you should never use straw in a situation where you might have sparks or flame. Now, you can actually use bales of straw for all sorts of structural things. People will dump some dirt on top of them and make a little raised bed out of it. And that's nice because you don't have to bend over and the straw breaks down over time. People use it for the sides of greenhouses. I've seen that before, where they'll just make an inexpensive lean-to out of corrugated plastic, and then they'll stack up straw bales on the sides as walls, and it lasts for years, but it won't last forever. And if you end up having a fire, all of that's going to burn very quickly. What things in your life are you standing on that are just bales of straw? The thing about straw is if you look at it, it's really obvious that it's straw. If you touch it, it's itchy, it pokes you, it's obvious that it's straw. But in life, not everything that is straw or wood seems like it's straw or wood. Now, I mentioned wood. Wood's a lot stronger than straw. You can build a house out of wood. This wall behind me is made out of wood. It's a typical construction material in the United States today. Most of the houses in LA that burned down were made out of wood, and they seemed really stable for a really long time. A lot of those houses were over 40 years old. Now, when people decided to build those, why did they choose to use wood instead of concrete? Concrete is very expensive. The other thing is that that's an earthquake-prone area, and sometimes it's cheaper to build a house out of wood in an earthquake zone, knowing full well that if the earthquake's bad, the thing's going to collapse, because it's cheaper to build and rebuild, whereas concrete costs a lot more. But concrete is resistant to fire. Well, the concrete itself is fireproof. And so you only have to worry about the things that aren't concrete burning. What things in your life are wood, but you might not see them as such? What things are flammable that might not seem flammable? Now we want to transition to an interesting story in the New Testament, in the beginning of the story of Jesus. Sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that if something seems religious and has obvious value, it will stand the test of time, it will never change, it will never be replaced by something of greater value, and it will never be threatened by fire. Should we? Now, I said we're going to get to the story of Jesus. Let's go back even further first and talk about the time of Moses. When the Israelites were conquering the Promised Land, they received specific instructions from God on what could be retained and what could not be retained. Those instructions applied to the people, and it also applied to the spoils of war that were material. In some cases, at least, they were commanded to only keep the goods that could pass through fire without being consumed. And that's really interesting. It wasn't the case that whatever they got out of the battle that God himself had ordered them to fight, that wasn't a rubber stamp to indicate that everything that came out of that was valuable or would last or was even worth having at all. You see, there were still tests. And we're told to pay attention to these things. In life, we're told to test ideas, to hold fast to what is true. Circumstances change, and so must value, and so must our idea of value. And we get into big trouble when we apply this binary sense of value, as in only good and only bad, and no differentiation between things that are good, no differentiation between things that are bad, and no transfer between good and bad, even as we gain experience or understanding or our circumstances change. So now let's talk about the beginning of Jesus, his mortal life anyway. So after he was born, his parents took him into the temple, as was the custom. In the temple, we're told that there were at least two people there, old people, who had spent their lives in dedication to God and who each were expecting to meet the promised Messiah. Simeon and Anna were their names, and Simeon was given a promise that he would not die until he had met Messiah. So both of them got the chance, and Anna prophesied. Simeon celebrated. Let me ask you something. Is that a wonderful thing that could happen? Yes. Was that a special thing that was much further beyond what almost all of Israel experienced at that time in Jesus' life? Yes. Were these devout people who had honor from God, that God recognized as righteous? Yes. What happened to that temple? That was the same temple that the Lord years later declared would be torn down so thoroughly that one stone would not remain on another. Why? Because it was part of the fulfillment of what Moses had said so many years before, that God would send a prophet that was even more important than he was, and anyone that rejected him would be cut off from the promises given through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The temple was destroyed because it was defiled, and it was defiled by the people that ran it, who rejected Jesus. The temple was built to receive the Lord, but they used it to reject him. And in doing so, they were rejected. And their building was destroyed by the Romans completely. Not one stone on another. What things in your life are like that temple? That are made out of straw, that seem solid, but cannot abide the fire? And are you chaining yourself to those things because they seem sturdy, solid, and immovable? Are you misplacing priorities in your life as far as what God deems valuable and setting yourself up to be burned with the straw when the fire comes? We could go through so many examples of people that have put undue importance on certain things, who've assigned unsubstantiated permanence to certain things in their lives. You need to pay attention to this. When the best time to unchain yourself from flammable materials is before the fire comes. You use things for what they're useful for. But when something better comes, Paul talks about this, when something better comes, you have to let go of what it displaces, which is obviously worse. If you had the choice between following Jesus or following the leaders in the temple, which would be better? It's obvious, right? And yet that same split is something that people get wrong every day. The second best time to unchain yourself from the straw is when the flames come. When you see something burning and you are attached to it, you better detach from it. What did all those people in LA do when their neighborhoods were burning down? They left. They didn't sit there and say, oh, I've been in this house for 40 years. It's protected me from the elements. We've gotten through 3 earthquakes in this house, or whatever it is. Surely it won't burn down. God gave me this house and he will protect it. No, they got the heck out of the houses, right? Because the time had come where their usefulness had ended and something better was presented, namely a place that wasn't on fire. Don't leave yourselves chained to flammable objects. Look at the religion you espouse, first and foremost, but then extend this across your whole life. What things are you holding to out of tradition, but not because of rational utility, rational value? What things have you leaned on that have collapsed under your weight and you're still clinging to them as if they're supporting you when they're not? Obviously, they're not. Think about this. It applies to so much in modern life.